I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, my colleague and co-host, and we're joined by the investigative reporter of the Washington Examiner, Sarah Westwood, reporting on the State Department during Mrs. Clinton's years, 2009, 2013. And new information, at least new to me, and it's being published right now, so it's on your Washington Examiner site, that the Inspector General's position at State was unfilled with a permanent IG for all the time Mrs. Clinton was there. And what does this mean? It means that the watchdog wasn't in place. But what watchdog was there, temporary, no longer there, is someone who is now linked to severely editing reports about misbehavior, malpractice, abuse of power, putting Mrs. Clinton at risk when she's overseas, and also covering up unsavory reports about ambassadors. Sarah, very good evening to you. The watchdog was temporary, but the watchdog was put under pressure, was led to believe that amending reports was consistent with his job. What is his name, and what do we believe he did while Mrs. Clinton was Secretary of State? Good evening to you, Sarah.
Good evening. This is a man named Harold Geisel. He served as the temporary Inspector General from 2008 to 2013. So all 4 years of Hillary Clinton's tenure, he was in an acting capacity in that role. And there are a lot of concerns that lawmakers have when Inspectors General are temporary because they don't have the same independence. And you saw that reflected in the fact that Geisel presumably was pressured to remove damning passages from IG reports before they were made public that showed that Clinton's top officials were interfering in investigations into diplomatic officials.
For example, Mrs. Clinton's security detail. What is alleged in these documents that was removed while Mr. Geisel was the temporary watchdog?
Well, about one ambassador in particular, it's alleged that these these officials stopped investigators from looking into some allegations of pedophilia, some pretty serious stuff. Another passage that was removed from these reports shows that Hillary Clinton's security detail allegedly were soliciting prostitutes while they were on official travel. These were some really salacious allegations that were levied against State Department officials that were supposedly, according to the early drafts of these reports, covered up by the top staff at the State Department.
Thaddeus?
Sarah, I'd like to stress the point that you made, and you can help to elaborate upon it. He was an acting IG, Inspector General. Would that not make it so? How much harder does that make him to do his job as a practical matter?
Well, this is actually something that you've seen Congress take up lately. The Homeland Security Committee in the Senate just had a hearing on this last week, because when you have an acting Inspector General, more often than not, they're hoping to get that nomination to become the permanent IG. And because of that, they're reluctant to rock the boat, so to speak. They don't want to initiate any investigations that could embarrass the agency, that could draw a lot of scrutiny to their tenure, because they're just hoping to get that Senate confirmation. And so you always see acting inspectors general create those sorts of problems, and it's why it's really important to have these permanent IGs in place that aren't affected by the political winds.
What you're telling is a story of a State Department that was poorly led, poor leadership, poor accountability. You tell one spectacular story. It sounds like it's too fantastic to believe. People took guns to the elevator bank because there was so much hatred going on. Why?
That was because the way the State Department was laid out, you had investigators with the Bureau of Diplomatic Security physically located in the same office as the diplomatic officials they were investigating. So what would happen is that these investigators would launch investigations into agency officials and perhaps find them guilty of some sort of offense, and those officials would go on leave And when they would come back, those diplomatic security officials had guns, and the investigators who put them out in this administrative leave would feel fear that they were going to get into a gunfight in the elevator. And that's something that was originally in the report, and that section of the final draft is actually completely redacted.
Thaddeus?
Don't put the junkyard dogs in the same pound with the suspects, you know. Sarah, in your experience, is there any similar situation to a Secretary of State's tenure being like this? I mean, usually it's a sedate diplomatic place.
That's why we call it Foggy Bottom, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, usually, right, there's not this much politicization surrounding someone's tenure. There's not this much appearances of impropriety. And you certainly very rarely see instances where the Inspector General amends reports before they go out. The last time we saw this happen was at USAID back at the end of last year. And the acting Inspector General who was caught doing this almost immediately stepped down because this was a very big, it's a very grave charge to levy against an Inspector General that they were covering up for the agency, because that goes against the entire ideal of Inspectors General. Geisel's no longer with the IG's office. Ironically enough, as soon as Hillary Clinton left the State Department, President Obama nominated a permanent Inspector General, and Geisel's no longer the watchdog there.
Far-fetched question. Do we have any understanding of an email chain, Mrs. Clinton being informed about this misbehavior, about the amending? Do we know anything about her experience or her knowledge of these events at the time?
We don't yet, but we are possibly in line to learn, because Citizens United has filed a lawsuit for these exact documents. The final draft of this report came out in February 2013, and even the heavily edited version and this sanitized final public draft still caused controversy, because there was a single sentence in it that said perhaps Bureau of Diplomatic Security investigators could be subjected to, quote, undue influence. And even that one sentence sent Congress probing, what sort of undue influence? What are you talking about? And now that we see these early drafts, we see there was a lot of undue influence from the 7th floor from Clinton's office. And so certainly this is something that has a lot of interest to a lot of people, and we have to just wait and see what the result of that lawsuit is.
So if any of the campaign staffs anticipating taking on Mrs. Clinton as the presidential nominee are listening to us tonight, you might want to contact Sarah Westwood at the Washington Examiner. These are early days. As Sarah said, Mr. Geisel's sitting at home, a disappointed Inspector General at the State Department, with a story to tell about the emendations of reports of misconduct while Mrs. Clinton was Secretary of State. Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. We thank Sarah Westwood, WashingtonExaminer.com. Very easy, guys. I have her email. I'm John Batchelor.